Christos anesti. Bravo. Christ is risen. Or as my wife says, yes, indeed he do. When in Scripture we first meet God, apparently he's talking to himself, or to that portion in his midst which he has only lately quit to avail our occasion. In prayer, therefore, we become most like him, speaking what no one else, if not he, will attend. A book I borrowed once taught me how, in the midst of attendant prayer, comes a pause when the addressed requires nothing else be said. Yes, I witnessed once an emptying like that, though what I saw was not quite seen, of course. I suspected, nonetheless, a silent other, silently regarding me, as if he still might speak, but speak as to himself. That was yesterday or many years ago, and if it profit anyone to imitate the terms of that exchange, let the prior gesture be extreme hollowing of the throat, an inclination to articulate the trouble of a word, a world thereafter. I want to read a resurrection poem. What I'm going to do is I'm going to read a poem called Three Descents, and it's in three parts. First is Aeneas, the second is Orpheus, and the third is Jesus. Aeneas. As the beloved Palinurus sank more deeply beneath wave and memory, as the remnant of his race descended painted planks to step on foreign shore and there spark fire, gather wood and water, even as the god's red fist fell hard into the sea, Aeneas pressed through tangled underbrush to gain the door to hell. First, of course, he found the temple of another petty god, graved with images of all that lay ahead, his fortune and the fate of every soul he'd implicated in his flight from Troy. He barely looked. So used he had become to how little pleasure time could bring, so engaged by the prospect of stepping briefly out of it, if only to return to time's demands when he returned to light. He hurried through the golden vault to find her, whose words would lead him through the awful gates. And what would he remember years from now of what he'd find? Little, save the figure of his own father coupling death, nearly indistinguishable amid that mass of shades, like dogs tied together, whining. And the figure of the Sibyl, likewise bound, then tossed. A bent toy skipped across a marble floor, mute refusal widening her eyes, opening her throat as the god's thin voice coughed out the infernal terms Aeneas believed he saw it might welcome until he heard them. Orpheus. That his eyes positively shone with the image he had shaped, of sweet reprieve, of his hand upon the beloved, lifting her from the narrow crypt, caught floating on barren stillness, unaccustomed silence, could not be comprehended by those few whose minds retained a trace of how the present gloom was nothing of itself, but served to amplify the absence of the luminous occasions worked above. That his lit gaze upon those shades who lined the path could hurt them like a flame did not occur to him, though he observed their trembling as he passed, had puzzled as they shrank, slipped back into the discs. Her tender heel bitten to the bone, the woman could barely walk the ruined path she followed down, and as he pressed with greater speed to apprehend, her frail figure hobbled by its crumbling clay. She turned, to understand the source of sudden suffering, as if a boy had held a surgeon's glass above a shriveling midge now stricken by the sun's light, drawn and focused to a beam. As their eyes met, her loss was total and immediate. When he returned alone to the sunlit world of things, his life became one long attempt at shaking free his culpability in her undoing. And later, as his own flesh was torn, his body sundered by the famished hands of famished women, he breathed a single note, contrite at how his lesser love had hurt her. Jesus. That his several wounds continued to express a bright result. That still the sanguine flow coursed, tincturing the creases of his cheek, and wended as he walked to bless the bleak plutonic path with crimson script, declaring just how grave the way that he had come. That underfoot, the very clay he traveled sank beneath an unaccustomed weight, occurs as no surprise. That he was glad is largely otherwise, as would be the news that every sprawling figure found en route acquired at his approach an aspect far more limpid than the lot that lay ahead, as if his passing gained for hell itself a vivifying agency. Each shade along the way rose, startled, blinking, at once aware that each had been, until this moment, languishing, until this moment, dead. Thus, suddenly aware that each among the withered crowd had by his presence met a sudden quickening, the multitude made glad by his descent inclined to join him on the path, recovering each loss, exulting in each past made newly present. His etched face luminous and very flesh made brilliant by the unremitting pulse. He gains the farthest reaches where the ache of our most ancient absence lay. He lifts our mother and our father from beneath the mindless river, draws them to himself, and turns. Someone was asking at dinner what the effect, or what the collision of classical texts and contemporary writing might occasion, and that was an example. I know that wasn't funny, but I hope you'll laugh a little off and on. It makes me feel better. You know how you all know poets are deeply lazy people. So this is how the epigraph was. This is why the epigraph was invented, is to save work. So you know, if I put a little something here that sort of sets up as sort of stage directions, what then comes, that means it's something I didn't have to make. So I steal it from someone else, and it kind of gets the ball rolling. In this case, I had to work a little bit because I couldn't remember exactly where I'd seen what I wanted to include here. So I came up with, as well as I could recall, something of a paraphrase of the text, and then I came up with someone to say it. So the poem is called As We See, and the epigraph reads, and I did read something like this somewhere. I think it's in, it is in Maximus the Confessor, but I just didn't remember that until like 3 years after this was published. So. The epigraph reads, "The transfiguration of our Lord, that is, the radiance in which he was bathed at the pinnacle of Mount Tabor, did not manifest a change in him, but a change in those who saw him. And that's attributed to Isaac the Least, which was an opportunity to laugh. And you need to take those opportunities, because I used to be off and on a funny poet, less and less so. Suppose the Holy One whose face we seek is not so much invisible as we are ill-equipped to apprehend his grave proximity. Suppose our fixed attention serves mostly to make evident the gap dividing what is seen and what is here. The book there on the stand is arduous to open, entombed as it is in layers of accretion, layers of gloss applied to varied purposes, hardly any of them laudable. So many guarded ploys to keep the terms quite still, predictable. Which is why I'm drawn to, why I love the way the rabbis teach. I love the way they read, opening the book with reverence for what they found before, joy for what lies waiting. I love the word's ability to rise again from chronic homiletic burial. Say the one is not so hidden as we are kept by our own conjuncture, blinking, puzzled, leaning in without result. Let's say the meek, the poor, the merciful, all suspect his hand despite the evidence. As for those rarest folk, the pure in heart, intent on what they touch, they see him now. We were also speaking, I think, a little offhandedly, nonetheless earnestly, about Midrashim as a model. And so I'm going to read you a few poems from this book called Recovered Body. None of these are in this, not because I don't like these, but because when I was doing the contract for this one, a friend of mine had just agreed to reprint this, and he just spent a lot of money making a couple thousand copies, and then I just didn't think it would be right to mess with him. So I left all those out of this. So it's kind of like a selected poems, but this would be better. But these are oh, by the way, when I make someone up, very often I'll supply a biography, a biographical note, just to, I did this for an earlier book called The Translation of Babel, and so there's a character in that, the middle sections, the translation of Ramundo Lush, and so I invented a biography for him, which I thought made it clear that I'd made him up, but the editor of the press at that time, the University of Georgia Press, called me in a panic some weeks before the book was to appear, saying, "We looked through all the materials and can't find any release from the Ramundo Lush people." So I wrote one. But the biographical note for Rabbi Saab. This is from the recovered Midrashim of Rabbi Saab. Regarding the sage whom tradition has come to identify as Rabbi Saab, very little is known, though a great deal is suspected. He was apparently a learned man whose devotion to the one whose name is not spoken did not preclude his speaking that name frequently, and more often than not accompanied by a tone of accusation. He himself has been accused of apostasy, blasphemy, manic depression, drunkenness, bad manners. He has been praised for his compassion, revered if not much liked for his eager upbraiding of the pious. While most forgive him his denunciations, few forgive him his glee. As to whether the emanation of the dual Torah extends to comprehend even these recovered commentaries, opinions vary. I'll just read a couple. This is the Tetragrammaton, but I'm going to follow the tradition and say the Lord when that appears, as it does in the poem, off and on. And the Lord sat in the dust, bone weary after days of strenuous making, during which he now and again would pause to consider the way things were shaping up. Time also would pause upon these strange durations. It would lean back on its haunches, close its marble eyes, appear to doze. But when the Lord himself finally sat on the dewy lawn, the first stage of his work all but finished, he took in a great breath laced with all lush odors of creation. It made him almost giddy. As he exhaled, a sigh and sweet mist spread out from him, settling over the earth. In that obscurity, the Lord sat for an appalling interval, so extreme that even time opened its eyes and once, despite itself, let its tail twitch. Then the Lord lay back, running his hands over the damp grasses, and in deep contemplation reached into the soil, lifting great hands full of trembling clay to his lips, which parted to avail another breath. With this clay, he began to coat his shins, cover his thighs, his chest. He continued this layering, and when he had been wholly interred, he parted the clay at his side and retreated from it, leaving the image of himself to wander in what remained of that early morning mist. You were wondering how sin happened? Well, I'm here to tell you. So this is called the entrance of sin. Am I speaking loudly enough? I have a bad habit of, when I'm really drawn into the beauty of my own poem, of getting a little quiet, and sometimes I just, it's reverence. The entrance of sin. Yes, there was a tree, and upon it, among the waxed leaves, an order of fruit which hung plentifully, glazed with dew of a given morning. And there had been some talk off and on, nothing specific about foregoing the inclination to eat of it. But sin had very little to do with this or with any outright prohibition. For sin had made its entrance long before the serpent spoke, long before the woman and the man had set their teeth to the pale, stringy flesh, which was, it turns out, also quite without flavor. Rather, sin had come in the midst of an evening stroll, when the woman had reached to take the man's hand, and he withheld it. In this way, the beginning of our trouble came to the garden almost without notice. And in later days, as the man and the woman wandered idly about their paradise, as they continued to enjoy the sensual pleasures of food and drink and spirited coupling, even as they sat marveling at the approach of evening and the more lush approach of sleep, they found within themselves a developing habit of resistance. One supposes that even then this new taste for turning away might have been overcome. But that is assuming the two had found the result unpleasant. The beginning of loss was this. Every time some manner of beauty was offered and declined, the subsequent isolation each conceived was irresistible. We're going to have to cheer up. Nothing like Jonah to cheer you up, right? Yeah. You'll remember this. The word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai, go at once to Nineveh, that great city, and proclaim judgment upon it. For their wickedness has come before me. Jonah, however, started out to flee to Tarshish from the Lord's service. What might one then expect when fleeing the Lord's imperative? Well, an obstacle of one or another sort, uneasiness of mind, missed connections, ungenerous companions, perhaps an enormous fish. That Jonah was without joy at the prospect of Nineveh is well recorded. Less famous is his disinclination for any intercourse with unbelievers whom he, out of habit, identified as the unwashed. From birth, he'd been protected from most embarrassments: body odor, poorly cooked food, substandard grammar. And so the Lord in his compassion undertook to deliver Jonah from his own sin. Not fastidiousness as such, only Jonah's insistence upon it. His time in the fish's belly was like death. At the very least, it smelled like death to Jonah. In retrospect, the experience, fully imagined, might still provoke a necessary sense of how the body, unadorned by ointments, oils, or silk, is little more than meat, mere meat for fishes. And if, in that confusion of digesting debris, Jonah chose to distinguish himself from other meat, he would have to come up with other criteria. And pretty soon. Consider any brute swimmer driving with all his energies against the tide. Notice how ineffectual and potentially comic the effort appears from the chalk-white cliffs above. Gross facts aside, the monster was Jonah's deliverance, a more than sufficient transportation to a more likely perspective, from which Jonah was then fully willing to embrace anybody. So I'm going to read this one. It's called Possible Answers to Prayer. I can be a little cranky. I think you'll notice that off and on throughout the evening. But I love people more or less. I'm working on it. You know, it's slow. Possible answers to prayer. Your petitions, though they continue to bear just the one signature, I did mention that you should laugh when you get any kind of inkling of laughter. See, this one gets less and less funny as it goes, so I think that's maybe one of the only laugh lines. There are a couple others in there, but don't squander them. So anyway, it says your petitions, and then it says, though they continue to bear just the one signature. Have been duly recorded. Your anxieties, despite their constant, relatively narrow scope and inadvertent entertainment value, nonetheless serve to bring your person vividly to mind. Your repentance, all but obscured beneath a burgeoning yellow fog of frankly more conspicuous resentment, is sufficient. Your intermittent concern for the sick, the suffering, the needy poor is sometimes recognizable to me, if not to them. Your angers, your zeal, your lip-smackingly righteous indignation toward the many whose habits and sympathies offend you, these must burn away before you'll apprehend how near I am, with what fervor I adore precisely these. the several who rouse your passion. I wrote this in a coffee at a bookstore. Eighth Day Books. Can I get a witness? Anybody know what I'm talking about when I say Eighth Day Books? Warren Farha and Eighth Day Books. I speak of him as Abba Warren. He's so I was living in Wichita. When we first moved to Missouri, there was actually no church. I'm Orthodox, and there was no Orthodox church at the time. We built one in the meantime, but in the interim. But at the time, we would take trips to Wichita. You know, the excuse was going to church, but mostly I wanted to go see Warren. And I used to drive that strip of road up pretty often. There's a series of billboards there that, and you know, you probably have them around here. I don't think maybe that many, but in the Midwest, they're pretty commonplace. There's, you know, the billboards that say things like, "Jesus loves you, believe it or burn in hell forever." Very winning sorts of gestures. Well, so after about 30 miles of that, I was feeling a little anxious. So I went to the bookstore and sat down and poured myself a cup of coffee and worked on this. And it's called The Spiteful Jesus. Not the one whose courtesy and kiss unsought are nonetheless bestowed. Instead, the largely more familiar blasphemy born to us in the little boat that first cracked rock at Plymouth, petty, plainly man-inflected demigod established as a club with which our paling generations might be beaten to a bland consistency. That's pretty funny, too. He is angry. He is just. And while he may have died for us, it was not gladly. The way his prophets talk, you'd think the whole affair had left him queerly out of sorts, unspeakably indignant, more than a little needy, and quick to dish out just desserts. I saw him when, as a boy in church, I first met souls in hell. I made him for a corrupting fiction when my own father, mortal that he was, forgave me everything, unasked. And then I have a little series of things called, I better hurry. I'm not going to read the Adventures in New Testament Greek, but I recommend you're reading them. I want to try some new things on you that aren't in a book yet, because I'm fixing to send the book out pretty soon, and you're my guinea pigs. The book is, I think, going to be called Idiot Psalms, which I like quite a bit, but I get that kind of mixed response pretty regularly. And you know, and to be honest, I have no idea what the book will be called, because I hardly ever get the title I ask for when a publisher decides to take a book. This, for instance, was supposed to be called Slow Pilgrim, which I think is a perfect title. Slow Pilgrim. Isn't that just elegant? But they said, why do you want people to think of old guys with buckles on their shoes when they read your book? Well, it turns out I didn't really want them thinking that. But, you know, I didn't think that that's what they'd think. But the marketing department at Harper San Francisco at the time was pretty convinced that would be the first take, and that no one would take it off the shelf. As it happens, no one took this off the shelf. And that part isn't funny. Okay, I better get going here. This is called Parable. To what might this slow puzzle be compared? The rabbi is perplexed. That said, please bear in mind the rabbi has a taste for fraught perplexities. Comparisons have long obtained for those enamored of the word a measure of requital, have tendered, just here for instance, a momentary take, a likely likening, not to be unduly honored as anything well conclusive, but categorically toward. Still, I love these textures on the tongue and love the way their taste and feel so often serve to spin the body and the mind into one vertiginous assemblage. And so one asks, to what slight figure might the vast and inexplicable compare? A mist that penetrates the bone, the looming sea, the all but endless and unyielding green expanse above, or say, the laden word whose compass and whose burdens turn a multitude of keen articulations, full none of which quite seem to satisfy. I spend a good bit of time. I try to go every year. It doesn't happen every year, but most years I've gone, and some years I've gone many times to Mount Athos in Greece to work on myself and to be worked upon. Do you know anything about Agion Oros, Mount Athos? So this, if you look on a map of Greece in the northern part, you'll see reaching into the Aegean 3 peninsulas. This is Cassandra. It's essentially a resort area. This is Scythonia, also kind of a little rougher. I often say this is Cassandra, it's all beaches, very little clothing. This is Scythonia, a little more rugged, therefore a little more clothing. And this is Mount Athos, Agion Oros. It's basically monks, just monks. And lots of clothing. But so this is it's parsed into 20 pieces of land, upon each of which of those 20 pieces is what they call a ruling monastery. This is the main monastery. So there are 20 main monasteries, and then a lot of smaller enclaves, communities, or of monastics devoted to prayer. Down at the end is what these guys are. These are ascetics of the highest order, but they honor these guys as the desert dwellers. They call this the desert. Down at the end, where the monks live in, very many of them live in caves, and it was down there during one of my pilgrimages that I happened upon this poem. Is called Eremite. And Katanakia is down here. The cave itself is pleasantly austere, with little clutter, nothing save a narrow slab, a threadbare woolen wrap, and in the. Am I the only one hearing that, or are you hearing me? I love this poem. I don't want you to miss it. Am I having a seizure? I'll just be louder. It's called Eremite. The cave itself is pleasantly austere, with little clutter, nothing save a narrow slab, a threadbare woolen wrap. And in the chipped-out recess here, 3 sooty icons lit by oil lamp. Just beyond the dim cave's aperture, a blackened kettle rests among the coals, whereby each afternoon a grip of wild greens is boiled to a tender mess. Thank you. The Eremite lies prostrate near 2 books, a gospel and the Syrian's collected prose, whose pages turn assisted by a breeze. Besides the thread of wood smoke rising from the coals, no other motion takes the eye. The old man's face is pressed into the earth, his body stretched as if to reach ahead. The pot boils dry. He feeds on what we do not see and may be satisfied. And in the little town of Uranopoli, which is where I wait for the boat, catch the boat to Marathos, I wrote this. The poem is called Nothing, which I realize is just asking for trouble. I can imagine the reviewer saying, and one of his poems was called Nothing, and he was absolutely right about, yeah. I know people like that who would write that. So anyway, the poem is Nothing. It has an epigraph, and you know why. But this is from St. Gregory Palamas. No evil thing is evil insofar as it exists, but insofar as it is turned. What had I meant to say just now? I have forgotten. Which among the extant flourishing phenomena are you? Is that a limp? The evening drifts into its routine dimming of particulars, quite literally evening the scene along the shore. We're all made even now, though you're still limping. The little boats at anchor have retained a single stroke of gold to edge their canvas canopies, lent them by the setting sun's last flare. Their painted hulls have all gone gray, if variously gray, and we are strolling the gray pavement to our suppers at the beach cafe, to Psaro Taverna, we like to say. I'm hoping for grilled octopus, metzatziki, paracalo, kemiabira. Do you suppose those lights ahead might frame our destination for the night? I think they might. We'll reach them soon enough. And when we have, we'll see with both our rods and cones, and suddenly our colors will return. Meantime, have you noticed how our evening stroll compels our taking pains, attending to the variegated shade in hopes of stepping clear of ruts along the gray? None of them is adequately evident amid continued dimming, which has of late become so nearly palpable that one could almost take it or mistake it for something of itself. Now, I grew up on the West Coast, not far from Seattle. It was actually in a little town called Tacoma. Anyone know where Tacoma is? Well, you know, as you know, probably Tacoma, it's a Native American word. It means, when's the next bus for Seattle? Well, I grew up pretty much on the Puget Sound, and now I live in Missouri, and I don't know if you are that keen on geography, but it's in the middle. And if you notice, there's no beach. So I wrote this when I was realizing I'd been there for 12 years and didn't see much opportunity of leaving anytime soon. It put me in a mood. It also happened to be Lent. It was last year's Lent. I feel better now, but it's called Lenten Complaint. The breakfast was adequate, the fast itself subpar. We gluttons, having modified our habits only somewhat within the looming Lenten dark, failed quite to shake our thick despair. An air that clamped the heart made moot the prayer. As dim disciples, having seen the light, we supplied to it an unrelenting gloom. Wipe your chin. I'm dying here in Omaha, amid the flats, surrounded by the beefy, landlocked generations, the river and the river's rancid shore. Oh, what I wouldn't give for a lifting, cool, salt breeze, a beach, a Labrador. See, I told you, it was not a happy time. So I wrote some plaintive, they're not all plaintive, but you'll see. I'm going to read you some idiot psalms. And you'll realize they are duly entitled, or it's unlikely. So this, the first one's called Idiot Psalm 1. But it has a little instruction, a psalm of Isaac, accompanied by Jew's harp. O God, beloved, if obliquely so, dimly apprehended in the midst of this, the fraud obscuring fog of my insufficiently capacious ken. Ostensible lover of our kind, while apparently aloof, allow that I might glimpse once more your shadow in the land, avail for me a second time the sense of dire presence in the pulsing hollow near the heart. Once more, O Lord, from your enormity incline your face to shine upon your servant, shy of immolation, if you will. Idiot Psalm 2. A psalm of Isaac accompanied by baying hounds. O shaper of varicolored clay and cellulose, O keeper of same, O subtle tweaker, agent of energies both appalling and unobserved, do not allow your servant's limbs to stiffen or to ossify unduly. Do not compel your servant to go brittle, neither cramping at the heart nor narrowing his affective sympathies, neither of the flesh nor of the alleged soul. Keep me sufficiently limber, that I might continue to enjoy my morning run among the lilies and the rowdy waterfowl, that I might delight in this and every evening's intercourse with the woman you have set beside me. Make me to awaken daily with a willingness to roll out readily, accompanied by grateful smirk, a giddy joy, the idiot's undying expectation, despite the evidence. Idiot Psalm 3. I wrote this in an English department meeting. A psalm of Isaac whispered mid the Philistines. Master, both invisible and notoriously slow to act, should you incline to fix your generous attentions for the moment to the narrow scene of this, our appointed tedium, should you, once our kindly secretary has duly noted which of us is feigning presence, and which excused, which unexcused, you may be entertained to hear how much we find to say about so little. Among these other mediocrities, your mediocre servant gets a glimpse of how his slow and meager worship might appear from where you endlessly attend our dreariness. Holy One, forgive, forgo, and if you will, fend off from this my heart the sense that I am drowning here, amid the motions, the discussions, the several questions endlessly recast, our paper ballots. I think that's almost enough of that. Let's skip ahead. Yes, they get a little bleaker for a while and then they cheer up. And let's just get there. So what we have here, this isn't exactly cheerful either, but Μετά φόβου Θεού πιστέως και αγάπης προσέλθετε. That's what the priest says when we come up for the communion. With the fear of God, faith, and love, draw near. A psalm of Isaac, sore afraid. Forgive, O fire. Forgive, O light. The patent fraught impurity of we who thus presume to open unclean lips, availing now a portal for your purity. Forgive the chatter of our blithely fearless crowd, awaiting your pure body pretty much the way we stand in any fast food queue, considering our neighbor's faults, puzzling at those odd few who seem to shiver some as they approach your wound. Holy One, allow that as we near the cup, before the coal is set upon our trembling tongues, before we blithely turn and walk again into our many other failures, allow that we might apprehend something of the fear with which we should attend this sacrifice, for which we shall not ever be found worthy, for which I gather we shall never be prepared. I'm going to read you a love poem, and then a sad poem, and then another communion poem, which ends more happily. So this is for my wife, Marcia. She's observed to me not too long ago that I never write anything about my family, and I haven't written a love poem in a long, long time. And she was right, and it's shameful. So I wrote this. When I say I ache for you. First, though, I should make clear that when I say I love you, I admit a deep confusion figuring a mix of selfish joys and gratitude. And if I say you are my life, such talk would also prove both broadly vexed and gesturing an ever more elusive trope with weak abstraction dimming the horizon. Early on, startling to the fact of you, then waking in my sleep-slow arms, I'm sure I said, you have made me better than I was. Whatever that has come to mean by now. But when I say, I ache for you, I am not speaking metaphorically, as every figuration quiets to this moment, mute, which absolutely aches, as if the heart had risen from its roaring cave to press with sudden heat and weight low in the throat, an absolutely animal occasion where the pulse and all its music meets the breath, just here. You know what a threnody is? Well, this is one. It's a song for the dead. The dream is recurrent, and yes, the dream can leave me weeping, waking with a start, confused, and pressing my wet face hard into the pillow. That is to say, the dream is very bitter. The scenes are various, the gist unchanging. My father returns, and we are all at once elated that his death was apparently an error, that he had simply been away, a visit to the shore. Then increasingly, I grow uneasy about how deeply he has changed. He is both frail and distracted, or it could be that he withholds some matter pressing on his mind and none of us dares speak, neither of his death nor of his sudden startling return. We share other confusions as well. He has arrived in the camper truck he drove when I was a boy, but my wife and children are also here to greet him, even my son, whom he has never met. Often, in the dream, I am the one who first suspects he cannot stay. I am the one who sees but cannot say his visit will be brief. And just as I suspected, as I feared, I wake. Draw near. Proseltete. For near is where you'll meet what you have wandered far to find. And near is where you'll very likely see how far the near obtains. In the dark Catholicon, the lighted candles lent their gold to give the eye a more than common sense of what lay flickering just beyond the ken, and lent the mind a likely swoon just shy of apprehension. It was then that time's neat artifice fell in and made for us a figure for when time would slip free altogether. I have no sense of what this means to you, so little sense of what to make of it myself, save one lit glimpse of how we live and move, a more expansive sense in whom. And this is when I'm stopping. And now we're going to do a Q&A. Yeah, okay.
So we should have 2 students with microphones. If you would like to ask a question, please flag one of them down and they will come to you. And I'll start with a question of my own. How do you describe the term sacramental poetics, and do you think your work fulfills that term?
Can you hear me? Oh, I don't need to be there. I can be like Phil Donahue. That's just too old. That's too old, right? Nobody knows that. So all this time I didn't have to be there. Well, I wrote a paper called Toward the Sacramental Poetics, which I have given different versions of, and it's still in progress. Now I'm trying to get rid of the word sacramental because I can't find a good replacement necessarily, but sacrament is of course a legal term coined by Tertullian to indicate a portion of the guard, a portion to the church or the Caesar, depending. It was a thing that you would set off to take care of some kind of business, a military or otherwise guardly business, and that doesn't seem right. So I'm trying to ditch sacrament, but it's hard because it's so pervasive, and people, hardly anyone thinks of it that way, so they always think of it the way that we want it to be thought. But so mystical poetics, that sounds a little too airy too, but that's what I would, because we of course in the Eastern Church refer not to the sacraments, but as to mysteries, holy mysteries. So I'm working on the term, but my sense is that it's a way of talking about what I would perceive as anything poetic. That is, anything that not only is but does. And the idea of something that is and does is not a merely Christian idea, nor a sacramental idea, nor a mystical idea, but it's the idea of, I guess, the rabbinic Hebraic sense of words is a little different than the way maybe many of us still think of words. We often think of words as being names for things, whereas in an earlier economy of the rabbis, a word was not just a name for a thing, but was a thing, and had agency and energy. And so that when I think of a poetic use of language, I think of a use of language that that doesn't merely act retrospectively or referentially, but also prospectively and generatively. And so that's what I understand to be a sacramental poetics is a poetics that insists that if we're going to call a thing if we're going to call a text a poetic text, we do so because it doesn't operate only to talk about what was, or to name what was thought, or what has happened, however moving that may have been, but insists upon a use of language that also opens the text to the reader's participation in it, partaking of it, being changed by it, so that there's an efficacy in our consuming the text that enlarges us. Yeah.
Questions?
Oh, there's a hand over there, way over in the corner. You're next. Or are you the microphone guy? Okay.
Hello. My name's John. I was wondering what your perspective was on rhyme and how it is used correctly and how is used incorrectly?
Well, did you hear how much of it I used? That's correctly used. And, wait, and did you hear when I didn't? Well, had I used it there, that would have been incorrect. But I don't know if you. I often write in form, but then more often I write in essentially a disguised form. So yeah, I write a primarily iambic cadence, but then I very often syllabically lay out the lines, the lineation, to occasion other things, which we don't have time to talk about. But in general, I do even use end rhyme, but hardly ever on the end of the line. That is, I'll use an iambic pentameter structure, but then I'll maybe line it in, I don't know, a trimeter, so that the rhymes are occurring, but they're not occurring on the ends of the lines. And so they're somewhat disguised, but they're, you hear them. And I also am really fond of internal rhyme in general and slant rhymes, and just, I think of it more as echoing sounds that give pleasure by their recurrence.
Thank you. You got a question over there?
You kind of stole my question, but I guess the second part was, how do you balance spontaneity with pattern? So you talked about some of your poems came very spur of the moment. How do you take those moments and then set them out into a pattern?
Well, when I was younger, there were times when poems came kind of spur of the moment, but that hadn't happened for years, decades. So mostly they're all the result of torturous labor. And I wish that they happened, on the spur of a moment, but they don't. But to balance, let's skirt the whole worry about balancing things by ingesting a poetic tradition, acquiring an internal sense of cadence and of echo. And then we focus on what the words are doing and not worrying about how they're laid out. Because what we do is we internalize a pattern, we internalize some sounds and a fondness for recurrent sound. And you just practice and write for many, many years. And then you can stop thinking about that, but it happens when you think about other things, such as how, what is this? How does this word lead to the next word, etc. And you don't have to worry so much about the formal descriptions are often how we speak of what someone's done, right? They're not, hardly ever are they how we speak of how to do. So very seldom do poets who have spent many years. Maybe early on they were laboring to acquire a sense of forms, writing in forms, fixed forms. But after that preparation has done its work and you own a kind of internal sense of form, then you can forget all about it. And if people do want to talk about metrics and scansion, etc., to describe what you've done, that seems more useful than using it as a proscriptive way of constructing a new poem. It's not eventually you stop using those forms as templates and filling them in, and you use them as generative. Those qualities, those elements as generative of matter, and then you just stop worrying about it altogether.
This is also a formal
question. You're coming
question.
next. Okay. Say that again?
I said this is also a formal question. I was wondering, it strikes me as hard to either overvalue the look of the line on the page or of the poem on the page, or the sound of saying the poem. And I wondered for you, in your sort of structuring and developing a poem, whether the sound or the look is more primary a value for you.
I have a hard time divorcing those because I say them as I make them, and the lining is very. There are kind of two ways of making meaning with verse poetry, and one, the primary sense is supplied by syntax, just the way the primary sense of prose work is supplied by word order and sentence structure. You start with a capital letter, and then you read till the end punctuation, and you stop a minute, and you make sense of what that said. And what verse does to that, verse still employs that as a code for primary sense of meaning. But what a verse poem then does, and this is why I basically work with the line as I work with the sound, is it interrupts that and supplies a kind of counterpoint to the sense of the syntax by giving the line its own sense, because the eye seizes momentarily upon a piece of the syntax and sort of registers how that means, and then moves on. And very often, if you're playing that well, the second part sometimes undoes what the first part said. So that, like this word on the end of the line, which you thought was a noun, turns into an adjective for this noun. So there's this like weird thing that goes on in your sense of things. You have this little vertiginous blip there that those of us who are perverse enough to enjoy ambiguity take great joy in. That little vertiginous moment where, oh, I thought that, oh, boom. It didn't say that, it said this. So you do that a lot in a great poem. A great poem does that a lot because that's why you can go back. That's, by the way, the measure of a great poem. You can read it again and again and again, and it keeps doing different things, saying, because you're able to work up different matter from it. And a lineation that takes into account the tension between the code of the line and the code of the syntax enhances that experience. But there's a hand there first.
Okay.
Honest, I was watching. Whoever.
What kind of impact do you usually want to give your audience? Is it more like introspective or like on to something else, like something beyond?
I couldn't quite hear every bit of that question.
What kind of impact do you want to make to your audience reading your poems? Do you want it usually to be something introspective or awe of something beyond or supernatural?
We have to choose? We can't...
Or, I don't know, like just what effect do you want on, like...
How do I want a reader to respond to the... Yeah, I want the reader to have a good time. I mean, I think if you're not giving pleasure of some sort, then that's not good. But it's not necessarily like, ha-ha pleasure. It's like sometimes there's a spiritual apprehension that's pleasurable. So I want that, but awe of, a sense. See, it's not like I have an idea and then I want to just put it on the page so that a reader can. It's not that I use the poem as a vehicle to give my idea into your head. It's more like I make this scene, I work on this place, I construct a place where I find stuff, where I discover stuff. And if I make it well enough, experience tells me that the reader can find stuff there. And it need not be the stuff I found. In fact, it's best when the reader brings his or her own energies and experience and needs, etc., to this scene, to this place, and somehow that place occasions for that reader a glimpse of some enormity that that she desires, say. That's what I want. Not that it ever comes, but that's what I want. I'm not sure. Are you guys keeping track of sequence? Because this guy's hand is up. Okay.
Good evening, sir. I'd like to know if you ever entertained the idea of how, for instance, a prayer becomes, what makes a prayer a poem, and how a poem can be kind of a prayer-like or prayerful. And among the...
I've already used all my jokes that come with that question, so, but maybe you all weren't there at dinner, so I maybe can try it again. Was it at dinner that I said that? Oh, yeah, maybe it was another space, but, so, okay, the first joke I usually say when I get that question is, that kind of takes all the fun out of it when I put it that way, doesn't it?
Yeah. Well, I would be more specific. Excuse me. Would you like to say that the Jesus prayer, teaching us how to pray, is actually poetic? And among the Psalms, which one is most pleasurable in terms of poetry to you?
Okay, that's a better and tougher question, but the scripture is comprised of poems, and the scriptures are comprised of prayer. But one thing that I have come to suspect about my own engagement with either of those activities is that poetry is a necessarily public undertaking, and that increasingly for me prayer becomes a less public undertaking, and is more efficacious when in fact it actually moves beneath language or into silence or stillness and nearness. So the point at which words are no longer necessary, I think that's when we attain to prayer. And all the language of the Psalms and all the language of the fixed prayers, the set prayers, all the language of the scriptures, in fact, that seem prayerful and poetic, they do their work to take us to that place where we might then lean into God's presence, and that would be prayer, actually. How's that? Thank you.
Great. Let's swing over here.
That's hard work.
My question actually kind of ties in with that one. You had mentioned before when you were talking about mystical or, mystical poetics, that I guess one of the goals or one of the aims is that the text would open us to the reader to participate and be changed by that. And I was wondering if there's a way that you feel that poetry is uniquely suited to opening us to change, to being changed.
The catch with that is that it requires a lot of work to be in a place for it to do that. I mean, poetry is really good at opening a text, moving us away from a sort of narrow, brittle sense of how words mean, and into a more efficacious sense of how words open and gesture toward what is inexhaustibly our God, who is inexhaustibly our God. And you get a glimpse of that enormity with words as they refuse to be pinned down. But to get to that place where poetry actually does that for us, it takes a lot of time messing with poems. There are other better ways, I think. I don't think everyone should read poems to have a prayer life. I think everyone should pray to have a prayer life, and that have a rule of prayer, and a discipline of prayer. And then, I mean, if you got to work on something. Poetry is one thing you can work on to acquire this. The reason I still cherish poetry is because poetry actually led me to prayer. It was a sort of, it was acquiring the discipline of poetry that helped me to kind of glimpse the discipline required for prayer, the kind of narrowing of the focus that would be then opening. It's a stillness that opens. And I learned how to do that with words, and then I finally, after many, many years, acquired an intermittent ability to apprehend God's nearness through a kind of quieting and stillness and focus. But if you're gonna, but see, that's a lot of work. Don't bother with poetry then. Just go right to prayer and start a rule of prayer that you do every day, diligently. You never fail. It should be not that demanding, because if it's too demanding, you'll have an excuse to not do it one day, and then you start over. You have to start over. So make it fairly undemanding, but don't ever miss it, and do it every day. And that discipline gives you, you are blessed for that discipline. Then you get a glimpse of how you say that prayer until you're done. And then some days you'll feel like standing there still and listening. And the words are done. And that set prayer has led you to a place where you're apprehending God's nearness, and that's actual prayer. And that's communion with God, which is what we all want, I think. So poetry can do that, but it doesn't have to be poetry that does it. Poetry is very good at doing that for people who are already doing that. But if you have a choice, I would just cut to the chase.
Part of the thing with cutting to the chase, poetry is intoxicating. How do you avoid the intoxicatingness of poetry?
I can't quite hear you. Could you kind of speak a little
Sorry.
more?
Realizing that poetry can pull us to a place almost away from prayer. Like when you're saying, I'm cutting to the chase and starting with prayer and not with poetry. Just how do you avoid the intoxication of poetry?
I guess I'm not quite ready to buy the premise that I should avoid the... I mean, there is an ecstatic tradition in Christianity that doesn't have a problem with a kind of joy, exultant joy, and it resembles, I suppose, intoxication. So I don't know. I think anything we can do to shake ourselves out of our numbness, our habits, our habitual taking for granted our surroundings, I think is a good thing. So I want that intoxication. And poetry is basically, what's intoxicating about poetry, in my experience, has been, it awakens me to beauty that I hadn't apprehended prior to those lines doing that one thing. And then it kind of sparks a love for beauty. And then that love for beauty kind of emanates out, and I'm nicer to my kids, and and kind of happy to see any dog that happens by. And I think what is intoxicating about poetry is something that ought to be intoxicating about all creation and meeting strangers and etc. So I just want to move more that way, not less so. And so I'm not going to be on guard against intoxication. I'm planning to have a scotch later, frankly. Yeah. But not much, just one.
Let's go here.
I'm not sure. Where are we? Where is Willie? Oh.
Let's go.
Eventually we'll get to you. Where are we now? Oh. Oh, okay.
Supposing such a one existed, and I think many do this evening, what would you recommend to a young and inexperienced poet inspired by the events of tonight?
I would extend my deepest regrets. I'm speechless. I think a young poet is to be encouraged and pitied. And my advice to that person would be that you really must develop a prayer life, because it's the only guard against despair. But that's true for anybody. I mean, prayer life. That's what I would recommend. I would do the Trisagion prayers of the Eastern Church. They're so simple. So I could ramble it off now, but I won't, because that feels wrong. But it's just this little set of prayers, and then at the end of them is the Our Father, and then you just get real quiet and don't hurry off. It's just a good beginning. It's the thrice holy Trisagion. Trisagion means thrice holy. It's a Trinitarian prayer that is really quick and efficacious toward getting us to a place where we can hear God speak to our hearts. And that's what a poet needs, to be able to deal with all the rejection. Or it's not even rejection. Rejection is sometimes at least someone's noticed,
I attend a public university, and I take a lot of workshops there. And half of me wants to reference the word as much as possible to make them look it up. And the other half of me wants to keep it simple, so I can ensure they understand what I'm trying to tell them about God and just about grace. And I was just wondering how you balance that between alluding to the word and making it accessible to those who don't read it often.
Well, I have a lot of questions with your question. And I mean, I would never avoid elusive matter that occurred to me if I was writing a poem and then I found myself referring to another poem, another text, a scripture, you can't worry about narrowing the reach of your poem to accommodate people who might not catch a reference. You don't want to do that. It's like writing poems for people who don't read poems, which a lot of people seem to want us to do. They put them on, put it on the bus then. They'll have to read it then. But so I just think, there are plenty of other things people could be doing besides reading poems. So you don't have to reach out to all the people with poems. They can do other things. And there are many of them find joy in those other things. But those of us who find joy in poems and in reading the scriptures, we bring everything to bear upon this thing you're making. Whatever it occurs to you to bring into that space, bring it. And if someone doesn't get it, be gracious enough to tell them where it's from and and how they could look it up if they want to. That's my friend Richard Howard. He's this great poet. He's a very grand style poet. He uses very difficult diction, very difficult vocabulary. And I just remembered one of our students in our workshop once said, something about, well, no one knows what that word is. And he goes, well, they can look it up. and he's exactly right. They can look it up, I look up, I hardly ever, even when I buy a new book of poems, there's a dictionary on my desk. If I come up, and this still happens, you think I know all the words. I don't. There are a lot of words I don't know. And so when someone finds one for me that I don't know and then puts it in a poem, I'm kind of tickled. And I go, oh, geez, I wonder what that is. And I look it up and I go, wow, that's great. So it's, people should take joy in having to do work to access a poem. It's kind of the part of the fun. So that's one thing I thought. The other thing is, it occurred to me, though you probably weren't saying this, but I've been in, I do have a sense that young Christian writers very much are hobbled by a sense that they're using their art, you name the art form, that they're obliged to use their art to teach people stuff, specifically Christian stuff, to teach people. And that's absolutely not what art is. Art is not a means by which you say what you know, or say what you think, or say what you believe. Art is necessarily a place where you explore it and discover it, and you attain a kind of devotion to the stuff of your art. If whatever your art form is, you have to get really, really in love with that stuff, and it loves you back by telling you things you didn't know, because you learn how to work with words, you learn how to work with musical notation, you learn how to work with pigment, clay, wood, stone, whatever. You learn to love that stuff and just develop a relationship with that stuff, and then it educes from you matter you hadn't apprehended. And that's what artists do, is they learn from doing art. Then someone else comes upon it, and if the artist has done it well enough, the not artist can find in that same space an opportunity to discover maybe not the same stuff, but some stuff that needs to be discovered. So don't ever think of your art as a means by which you communicate what you already have. It has to be the means by which you eke out what you don't have yet and get a glimpse of the immensity who loves us. And then other people will have a shot at seeing that in that work as well. Otherwise, it's just a waste of time, everybody's. Yeah.
So we're going to have 2 more questions, and over here is
well, they better be really good ones then.
The pressure's on.
So this question might have been partially answered by the previous. I guess maybe just in a simpler form. There are many things that characterize great art or beautiful art, but what for you distinguishes a great poet?
Oh, a great poet for me is the one I can keep reading. I mean, the great poem is the poem I can keep reading. And each time I open it, discover something new there, no matter how many times I've been through those lines, no matter how many of the words I've looked up, even if I've no longer have to look up any of the words. But still, every time I go through it, aha, another thing, yet another thing. Then that is what I would characterize as the great poem. The great poet is the one who does that once or twice in his life, or her life. Yeah. And our final question, yes.
Okay. This is kind of a personal question, but
well, forget it.
As far as the secular poems go, secular poetry, poems not written for Christians by Christians.
Which is to say most poems.
Yeah, most poems. What ones have you particularly found in your experience to be the ones that have most inadvertently quickened your devotional life? Most brought you nearest to God?
Well, again, I'm not terribly comfortable with the dichotomy, but.
I mean, I'm not suggesting.
No, I didn't hear that as the primary part of your question, but it's my problem. It's not your problem.
Yeah.
So Wallace Stevens, though, I don't even think that it's fair to think of him as a merely secular poet, but he's the greatest of the poets who refused to be identified as Christian until he was like dying. And then jury's out on that, but regardless, Wallace Stevens is one of the poets from whom I've learned the most.
And what's so attracted to about his poems?
She sang beyond the genius of the sea. I mean, How can you beat that? She sang beyond the genius of the sea. I wish I knew the whole poem, because who's got an iPad? The idea of order at Key West. Anybody going to Google that? Oh, it's not up yet? Oh, that's good. That's good. I think I can deal with this. So listen to this poem. This is so good. She sang beyond the genius of the sea. The water never formed to mind or voice, like a body, holy body, fluttering its empty sleeves, and yet its mimic motion made constant cry, caused constantly. See, this is that sacramental thing sneaking in on this. This secular poet writing sacramental poetry. He's got some nerve. Like a body, holy body, fluttering its empty sleeves, and yet its mimic motion made constant cry, caused constantly a cry that was not ours, although we understood in human of the veritable ocean. The sea was not a mask, no more was she. The song and water were not medleyed sound, even if what she sang was what she heard. Since what she sang was uttered word by word, it may be that in all her phrases stirred the grinding water and the gasping wind, but it was she, and not the sea we heard. For she was the maker of the song she sang. The ever-hooded, tragic, gestured sea was merely a place by which she walked to sing. Whose spirit is this, we said, because we knew it was the spirit that we sought and knew that we should ask this often as she sang. If it was only the dark voice of the sea that rose, or even colored by many waves, if it was only the outer voice of sky and cloud, of the sunken coral, water-walled, however clear, it would have been deep air, the heaving speech of air, a summer sound repeated in a summer without end and sound alone. But it was more than that, more even than her voice and ours among the meaningless plungings of water in the wind, theatrical distances, bronze shadows heaped on high horizons, mountainous atmospheres of sky and sea. It was her voice that made the sky acutest at its vanishing. She measured to the hour its solitude. She was the single artificer of the world in which she sang. And when she sang, the sea, whatever self it had, became the self that was her song. For she was the maker. Then we knew. I'm sorry, this is the best part. And when she sang, the sea, whatever self it had, became the self that was her song. For she was the maker. Then we, as we beheld her striding there alone, knew that there never was a world for her except the one she sang and singing made. Ramon Fernandez, tell me if you know why. When the singing ended and we turned toward the town, tell why the glassy lights, the lights in the fishing boats at anchor there, as night descended, tilting in the air, mastered the night and portioned out the sea, fixing emblazoned zones and fiery poles, arranging, deepening, enchanting night. O blessed rage for order, pale Ramon, the maker's rage to order words of the sea, words of the fragrant portals, dimly starred, and of ourselves, and of our origins, in ghostlier demarcations, keener sounds.
Thank you.
Sure. Let's give it for Wallace Stevens.
Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Visit biola.edu to find out how Biola could make a difference in your life.